During the 1930s, Crowley saw a lot of a very old friend of his who had first met in the United States in the First World War, Leigh Umphraville Wilkinson, who was a Shakespearean scholar and novelist. He had no interest in the occult at all, but he delighted in Crowley's company. And Crowley was an absolutely wonderful cook. And one day Crowley invited Wilkinson to dinner and gave him a really excellent meal and a book of his latest poetry. Wilkinson wrote a letter of thanks in which he praised the meal for pages, but unfortunately he forgot to mention the poetry. Crowley simply sent him a postcard saying, "On Crowley, the immortals ironically look. He sought fame as a poet, and he found it as a cook." But in fact, his real fame nowadays actually rests on the fact that he was a prophet, and what I wanted to explore was what exactly was it that he was the prophet of. Now, we're talking here about the Book of the Law. We've looked at how it was dictated, and we've seen the fact that in 1909, as a result of stumbling upon the manuscript, and as a result later of some extraordinary visionary experiences in the Sahara, Aleister Crowley accepted this book. In fact, it became the spine of his life. What was it about the book that had this extraordinary effect upon him? Well, for a start, if it is nothing else, the Book of the Law is an extraordinarily beautiful prose poem. But I think it goes further than that. It purports to be the document for the next stage in human evolution. It's unique in one way, certainly. It is the only document of its kind which abolishes itself. It says when certain things take place, then the Book of the Law will no longer be valid and another book will replace it. It is also a further attraction, the repository of perhaps the noblest ethical doctrines that have ever been enunciated in the history of humankind hitherto. Its principal commandment is, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." That means not anything as vulgar and trivial as "do what you want." No, it means within you there is a spirit, there is a purpose, there is something that you are here to do. Strip away everything apart from that, feel it, be it, know it, go, do it. It declares that every man and every woman is a star. That is to say that each and every person sitting in this audience, and even the speaker, is a star in infinite space, is divine. It declares that love is the law, a love under will. In other words, the nature of the law is love, but that love must be guided and directed by our fundamental purpose in life. So we have got these very fine and noble doctrines, but there's a further aspect to the matter as well. How many people here are familiar with Kabbalah? Right. Crowley was convinced that a further proof of the Book of the Law's veracity consisted in the fact that it contained an extraordinary number of Kabbalistic ciphers, which could only be solved by somebody with great intelligence and enormous knowledge of Kabbalah, and that this preterhuman intelligence, if you like, who dictated the Book of the Law, had knowledge greater than any man could possess at the time it was dictated. He thought it was our law for the next stage in the evolution of humanity. And one way of looking at it is to say that the Book of the Law is saying on one level, we must realize ourselves as animals before we can realize ourselves as gods, which is our ultimate purpose. And those of you familiar with the Egyptian gods and goddesses will know exactly what that means, I feel. Crowley dedicated himself to spreading the word he called thelema. Thelema is the ancient Greek word for will. Hence, do what thou wilt. There is no law, but do what thou wilt. Okay, you might say, I want to experience this sort of deep will within me. How do I go about it? And that is where various disciplines come in. For example, ceremonial magic, which, as I said, I feel it to be the yoga of the West, or yoga, or Zen Buddhism. Any way which has a valid series of mystical disciplines for the training of every level of our being. Intellect, emotion, body, sexuality too, so that we can experience the divine spirit within us. What Crowley did was to put out incredibly clearly written books of instruction in all the various ways in which you can tackle what we can well call the most important problem in human life. For example, when he tackled yoga, so much guff has been written about yoga, and really the essence of yoga is terribly simple. As Crowley put it, sit still, stop thinking, shut up, get out. When he was asked to expand this is a little bit longer, but I think he's got the matter in a nutshell. Firstly, we still the body by the practice called asana, and secure its ease and the regularity of its functions by pranayama, breath control. Thus, no messages from the body will disturb the mind. Secondly, by yama and niyama, we still the emotions and passions, and thus prevent them from arising to disturb the mind. Thirdly, by pratyahara, we analyze the mind yet more deeply and begin to control and suppress thought in general of whatever nature. Fourthly, we suppress all other thoughts by a direct concentration upon a single thought. This process, which leads to the highest results, consists of three parts: dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, grouped under a single term, samyana. And it's quite extraordinary how he manages to convey the nature and quality of the mystical experience without resorting to violently emotive language. This passage is very clinical and very clear. The process of dhyana, this is one of the great trances of yoga, not the greatest trance, it's the trance before samadhi. In the course of our concentration, we noticed that the contents of the mind at any moment consisted of two things, and no more: the object, variable, and the subject, invariable, or apparently so. By success in one-pointed concentration, dharana, the object has been made as invariable as the subject. Now the result of this is that the two become one. This phenomenon usually comes as a tremendous shock. It is indescribable even by the masters of language, and it is therefore not surprising that semi-educated stutterers wallow in oceans of gush. That's Crowley. All the poetic faculties and all the emotional faculties are thrown into a sort of ecstasy by an occurrence which overthrows the mind and makes the rest of life seem absolutely worthless in comparison. And Crowley proceeded to write beautiful, clear, and above all, short manuals on yoga. He contributed to Taoism. He translated the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching, and was one of the very few Westerners to have an understanding of the Tao. He was a very learned Kabbalist. One might call him the greatest occult scholar of the century. He was a very learned astrologer, and he made very fine contributions there. But what mattered to him most is the law of thelema and the means of achieving it. And to reiterate, Magic is the science and art of realizing the divine self by changing the human self. And right now, the planet is in a very critical time indeed. I honestly believe that the next 10 years will determine the ability of our species to survive upon this planet. I do think it is contingent upon the acceptance of do what thou wilt. Do what thou wilt is to bid water to seek its level. It is to bid sheep to eat grass, and it is to bid wolves to eat sheep. Unless individuals attune with the noblest, finest, most beautiful, and best within them, the result, I think, will be planetary disaster. Pollution will destroy us in the long run if the H-bomb doesn't get us in the short. I see it as a battle between stupidity and intelligence, as a battle between sleep and awareness, as a battle between those who want man and woman to realize themselves in their fullest and greatest capacity, and between those who would take the spirit of man and crush it, who would turn living, breathing human beings into ants with numbers. It is therefore crucially important at this present time that people do absolutely everything they can to maximize their own capacity and their own potential. And there are many ways of doing it, and to all these ways, Aleister Crowley contributed. Looking at the United States at the present time, I find myself with very mixed feelings in terms of its future evolution. I've seen wonderful work done by people involved in the esoteric here. I've also seen terrible things done by people who are not involved in the esoteric. It seems to me as though people are frightened, people are scared. It seems to me as though there's a sense that there's an impending catastrophe, and no one wants to admit it, and no one wants to discuss it. It seems to me as though there is an endeavor to make everybody bland and mediocre. And I'm certainly not saying this as a criticism just of the United States, because exactly the same thing is true of England. I think we are living in a terrifying time, but also a time of an exhilarating adventure. I think that over the next 10 years, we will see if we can cope with the drastically changing conditions prevalent upon this planet. I think it will take every ounce of our intellect, our emotions, our bodily skills, our intuition, our imagination, if we are to survive. And I think that if we make it, and I'm prepared to give my life to make it, because this is actually a very beautiful planet, and if the gods don't weary of us and just press a button, if we make it, it will be through a knowledge of the greatest and the finest and the best within us, through the use of techniques such as those written about by Crowley in order to bring out the noblest and best within us. And if we can do that for ourselves as individuals and share it with others, then the planet will make it. And that is the reason for the title of my book, for that will be the principal legacy of the beast. What I thought was there must be some people with questions, because I didn't want to talk for too long. There's something a little unsatisfactory about a totally passive audience that doesn't feed its own energy into something. I wondered if anyone had any comments or questions. Sir. Oh, okay.
Where does one begin reading?
Well, I think the best place is to start. I think Gems from the Equinox, edited by Rigardi, has got all the magical writings. There's also a very good edition called Magic, spelt with a K, and that's got his instructions on yoga as well. I think those are the two most important things, those in the Book of the Law. Those of you who are interested in tarot, I'm personally convinced that the best book on tarot that's ever been written is Crowley's The Book of Thoth. Right, I'm quite happy to mention the ATO. What would you like to know about the ATO?
I'd like to know your feelings about it.
Well, I'm a member of the Caliphate ATO. There are a number of organisations claiming to be the ATO. Myself, I've looked at it. As far as I can see, the Caliphate's probably got the best claim, and I'm happy to be a member of it. I'm quite happy to talk about the ATO. Don't see any big secret about it. Yes, very much. Best question so far. I've no idea. One thing I would say is I've got absolutely no idea what the ATO lodges are like out here. I'd very much like to meet some ATO people out here.
What's the lodge you belong to?
Albion Oasis. Albion Oasis, England. Yes.
And what is its history? How far back is it?
About 3 years. No, I mean, if you are, if we're going to get into the history of that, the ATO goes back to the turn of the century when it was founded by Karl Kellner, wealthy German ironmaster. It then went into the hands of Theodor Reuss, who was worked for the Prussian Secret Service and also sang in vaudeville. And in 1912, as a result of a meeting between Reuss and Crowley, Reuss became, if you like, converted to the Book of the Law, and the ATO accepted the Book of the Law, and Crowley became the head of the English-speaking sections. In 1921, Reuss became ill and nominated Crowley as his successor, and in, I think, 1925, the ATO elected Crowley as world head. Crowley died in 1947 and nominated Karl Germer as his successor. Germer died sometime later and left the matter unclear, as a result of which a number of organisations claim to be the ATO. The claim of the Caliphate ATO rests upon Major Grady McMurtry, who received letters from Crowley and who proceeded to get the ATO going. I rather look at it as emergency powers if the ATO looked like withering and dying, and he got it going again, with the help of a lot of people who'd been members of the ATO in California for quite a long time. But on that, in a book I've got coming out here in October called Crowley's Apprentice, which is about Israel Regardie, I wrote a deliberately boring footnote. It's terrible. But it's a joke on the reader, I'm afraid, but I might as well give you advance warning. It blathers on in minute detail about the issue of certain Golden Dawn charters. And just as the reader is about to play Russian roulette instead, I wrote the final sentence, which is really my view on the matter. But isn't the issue of charters, on the whole, an extremely boring one? If a group is doing good magical work, it doesn't need a charter. And if it isn't doing good magical work, then even a charter won't save it. Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned the Hydra-headed monster of the British press turning on Crowley. Hasn't the Hydra-headed monster turned on you recently?
Yes, you're very well informed. Yes, oddly enough, this is precisely what has happened. I decided to take a job, and I was housemaster and senior history master at this college, which is basically for the teenage children of millionaires. spoilt brats have been slung out of schools elsewhere for sex, drugs, rock and roll, a pretty wild bunch. But as it happened, I grew rather fond of them, and I did rather like my job. And all was going swimmingly until a paper called the News of the World decided to have a go at me. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Britain's News of the World, but it makes your National Enquirer look like the New York Times. In this paper, I was surprised to read, basically, there's the worst photograph of me that's ever been taken. You got it?
We're hoping you'll autograph them.
A headline, Devil Teacher, Master at Top School is Black Magic Weirdo. My book, The Legacy of the Beast, and Crowley Rigardi, The Law is for All, were top right-hand corner. Books of Evil, Bibles of the Sick Occult Sect. I am apparently a devil worshipper, and you'd better be careful because according to the article, I regularly gorge myself on human blood to get charged up. Now, I regularly attend meetings of something called the Order of the Eastern Templars, which regularly indulges in animal sacrifices and kinky group sex sessions. Now, if there's anybody here who knows of any kinky group sex sessions, I've never been to one, and I'd love to go, and they sound terribly good fun. Now, what else do I do? Oh yes, I'm sick, and my beliefs are sordid, and all my friends are sinister, and ooh, what a sinister bunch I see around me here. In fact, they went to the principal of the college and demanded that I be fired or they'd expose him. Not that he was an occultist, he was just a rather dodgy character. Creaming it in off these rather likeable brats at $150,000 a year net profit and never turning up for his own lessons. But that's by the by. What else have I done to offend the news of the world? Well, there's one remarkable thing. I can't even say when they interviewed me I was misquoted. No, it was flagrant lies from start to finish. There was one moment in the interview when these two guys who really, they looked like thugs. I mean, if you shook their hand, you know, you sort of wanted to go and wash it with Dettol or something. And they said, have you ever taken drugs? And I replied, a long time ago, when I was at Cambridge University, I tried marijuana. And they said, funny how they all say that. Oh, yes, isn't it? Got quite a sense of humour, haven't you, Mr. Sister? Well, I like to think so, gentlemen. And it was printed as, I advocate the use of drugs. I take marijuana and speed. I may have tried hard drugs. I can't remember. Well, I think if I'd taken hard drugs, you know, somehow I'd remember the fact. This was followed up, I got fired, it was followed up by another article, Devil Teacher Gets the Boot, which also revealed that the use of blood is common at OTA meetings. I'm kind of reminded of the story of the vampire that comes in to attack the young girl, and she sees the vampire coming in, and the crucifix is above her bed, and she grabs it and holds it up, and the vampire says, lady, it's not your lucky day. But actually, what I think is going to happen on this case is I've hit the news of the world with a writ, and libel in England is penalised very, very heavily if you can prove your case. And the article is so preposterous that my lawyers are rubbing their hands with joy, and every time they see me, they sort of go ding on a cash register. And I may well end up writing to the journalist in question, Dear Mr. Blythe, thank you so much for your incredible kindness in allowing me to retire for the rest of my life in considerable comfort. Any further questions? Yes.
I have one more, just a point of curiosity. Aleister Crowley had several children, and far as I know, there's one still living. And the last I heard,
Yeah.
he was 3 steps ahead of the FBI. And I was just wondering if you had information on that.
Well, one's got to be very careful about Aleister Crowley's children. It's rather like Aleister Crowley reincarnations. One of my minor ambitions is one day to give a party and to invite everybody who claims to be Aleister Crowley's reincarnation. I think it'll be utterly wonderful. I'm Aleister Crowley. No, you're not. I am. And so lock the doors and let them fight it out. As for his children, by Rose, he had his first child who died of acute nomenclature, and his second was Lola Zaza. Lola Zaza refused to see him after Rose left him to marry the eminent masochist Lieutenant Colonel Gormley. And Lola Zaza lived on, I believe, until the 1960s, not wanting anything to do with Crowley whatsoever. When he had a court case in the 1930s, there was this absolutely wonderful woman who, after he lost it, came up to him and said, that verdict is the wickedest thing since the crucifixion. And can't I do something for you? And he looked at her and he was too overcome to speak. And then she said, couldn't I be the mother of your child? And that caused him to cry for the first time in years. But once he'd dried his tears, I bet you, he dragged her off to the Savoy, knowing him. And, well, anyway, a baby was born. Now, I could be wrong, and I'd appreciate any extra information on this. I was under the impression that this was Alistair Ataturk, to whom Crowley wrote some very fine letters. And Alistair Ataturk, I think, died at some point in the late 1960s. I'm not aware of any other children. It was rumoured that Graham Bond of Graham Bond Magic was a rock band of the 60s, was an illegitimate child of Crowley. And has anybody here heard of Graham Bond at all? He was meant to have got into a fight with a Satanist, and as a result, he lost and he flung himself under a tube train. But it was never ascertained as to whether he was one of Crowley's illegitimate sons or not. So that's the information I've got on the matter. I'm sure if you really wanted to hunt it down, OTO Archives could probably help you.
In your book, you said that the AA is currently in a year of silence.
A period of
A
silence.
period of silence. Well, I know of at least 3 groups claiming to be the real AA. One of them advertises in the
More?
Gnosis. I was wondering if you know anything about these and if there's any claim to them having, well, being the real AA.
I'd say at the present time, any group openly shouting we're the AA is not.
What is the
What is the...
AA?
Oh, the AA. Right. You can look at it in 2 ways. Right. You can look... Good question. You can look at the AA in 2 ways. The way in which I like to look at it most is that it is a brotherhood and sisterhood of men and women totally pledged to the advancement of individual human consciousness and general human evolution, who put out systems and techniques for human beings to use in order for that function to be accomplished. That's it in its widest sense. In a more narrow sense, it refers to the system established by Aleister Crowley. He worked out a system whereby anybody could go from the very depths to the very heights, a system by which man could become God. And the full details of this system in Crowley's writings, most notably Gems from the Equinox and Magic in Theory and Practice. Because the AA has such a very high reputation, inevitably charlatans will endeavour to appropriate its name in order to con the gullible.
I wonder if I just heard contradiction that the person can go from one level to the highest level to acknowledge himself as a god. And before you mentioned that every one of us is God, so where is the
Well,
distinction between
well, if I understand...
is and to be?
Well, yes, we all are God. It's just that we don't realise it. And because we've been so screwed up by this utterly lunatic society in which we have the misfortune to live, complex techniques are required if we are to realise ourselves as the gods we are. And I really would like to reiterate that we won't realize ourselves as the gods we are unless we first realize ourselves as animals.
To elaborate on that,
Yeah,
is
surely.
there any difference between animal and God?
Yes, I think there is. An animal is an elemental. Animals are simple creatures. We are much more complex. The reasons the Egyptians portrayed their gods very often with the heads of animals was they were trying to make exactly that point, that we are the bridge between animal and God, that we have got an extra dimension of consciousness which the other animals do not have. Good question. I don't think we know for certain. It's just something that's always been said by every great religious teacher or mystic, and it seems a reasonable working assumption. But that should make it. What we're doing is we're cutting ourselves off from the animals instead of realizing the animal that we are within ourselves. We should be proud of it. Don't want to be what? Uh-huh. Okay.
Well, you mentioned, well, the necessity for individuals to realize their higher potentials
Yeah.
in order for survival to take place in the species.
Yes.
And I totally agree with you. Now, is the order you're a part of, is it making efforts to make more education or knowledge or training or whatever to do to more people?
I honestly can't speak for the OTO in the United States. It would be best to speak with its representatives. So in England, yes. The OTO is just one order of a number of orders committed to this ideal.
So how do they, I understand these been very secretive kind of orders and things. How are they?
Well, I mean, it's not that secretive. I mean, anybody who can get hold of a copy of Francis King's Secret Rituals of the OTO has got a copy of their initiatory ceremonies. And I'm sure that, well, in England anyway, the OTO normally puts a box number in various occult publications. I presume they'd do the similar sort of thing over here.
Okay. So I was wondering if they have some kind of purpose to attempt to.
Well, I mean, the purpose is nothing less than the transformation of the planet.
Sure. So how are they going about that?
Good question. The ideal is simply to get more and more people to develop themselves to their fullest limits, and by their actions in society, those people will affect all those with whom they come into contact, and every day a minor change in consciousness may be brought about. That is the idea.
So how are people implementing this practically? I mean, what are they doing? Are they making meetings more public or?
Well, no, it's not a public society. It's a private society.
Private society?
Yeah.
Making more books.
Yeah. The OTO, I understand, has embarked on a very full publishing program.
Publishing
Yeah.
program.
To make more and more writings available to the public. And so the thing to do would be to examine the catalogues of places like the Mandala bookstore here or the Bodhi Tree, and quite a number of OTO publications.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you. The urgency of techniques for realization of human potentials.
OTO is one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it.
Sure.
You must take the path that suits you.
Could you said you were going to say something about how Crowley had a unique understanding of Tao for Western, as opposed
Yes.
to the Taoist Chinese.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what Crowley saw is that essentially there are three basic axioms on life, on existence, I'm going to start with one of those three. Either existence is suffering, or existence is joy, or existence is existence. We call these the black school, the white school, and the yellow school, and they've all got valid techniques of magic and mysticism. Classic example of the black school, in fact probably the best example, would be Buddhism. Existence is suffering, the cause of suffering is craving, etc. Classic example of the white school would be Thelema, or certain of the Sufi sects, or the Tantric sects, operating from the premise that existence is joy. Taoism is the school of existence is existence. It's the art of doing everything by doing nothing. Have you read the Tao Te Ching?
Yeah, I have some understanding of some of the internal yogas
Right.
of Taoist priests. And I can sort of
Well, there's
understand-
Taoism as philosophy and Taoism as technique.
That's Taoism is all inclusive. You know, I mean,
Mm.
like the Tao Te Ching, that's they might call that intellectual Taoism.
Yeah, but I mean, Charles Luke's book, Taoist Yoga, for instance, could be described as a manual of, an interesting manual on Tantra, rather than, it's a set of techniques, rather than the Tao Te Ching, which is the heart of the matter.
Yeah. There's a, I don't know, it seems, it's all of the spirit, you know, all these, like, practices they would do, and it seems, I don't know, it seems to relate to what you're trying to describe.
Hmm. Well, there's, in The Legacy of the Beast, there is a chapter totally devoted to Taoism and Crowley's contribution to it. Yes.
To your knowledge, have all of Crowley's writings been published, or any of them have
There's still quite a number of unpublished writings, as far as I'm aware, many of which are in the possession of the Caliphate OTO. For example, there's never been a full account of the Paris working. That's never been published, or the Amalantara working. That's never been published. And I'm sincerely hoping that with the new publishing program, there's no. He also wrote an essay on mescaline, which I've never read and which I'd like to read. There are efforts made to get out all of his writings, and I think that is part of the OTO publishing program. But there is still quite a mass of stuff that is unpublished, and this includes volume after volume of his own magical diaries.
How would you compare the system of the OTO to the system of the Golden Dawn?
Okay. One way of looking at it is to say Golden Dawn starts you out in the shallow end and OTO chucks you in at the deep end. That's one way of looking at it. OTO tends to be more drastic in its effect upon people. OTO is totally committed to the Book of the Law. The Golden Dawn is not. You could see the Golden Dawn as part of the AA, in that the AA is concerned with individual initiation, and Golden Dawn is part of that. The OTO is not only concerned with individual initiation, it is also concerned with collective action. In terms of the magic worked, Golden Dawn is ceremonial, OTO is saxial. In the low degrees of the OTO, there's a great deal of ceremonial, which derives, in fact, from the Golden Dawn with one or two innovations. But the essence of the OTO is, in fact, sexual magic. And what is sexual magic? Well, sex magicians are people who believe that the act of sex is the holiest act in the universe.
I had a question on your definition of magic, and I didn't want to misquote you since it seems to be happening quite a bit lately. So can you restate that?
Yes, magic is the art and science of realizing the divine self by changing the human self.
And what do you mean by changing the human self? That was my question.
Well,
I know the techniques, but what is it about the human self that is changing or hasn't changed, or that these techniques are?
Well, I mean, we're all at times stupid, lazy, forgetful, mean, petty, spiteful, selfish, and with a small s. We all at times act like perfect shirts. Does that answer your question?
Do you think Crowley really started World War I?
No, but he brought America into the war.
Yeah.
Actually, that is one myth that needs to be hit on the head. One of the things that was thrown against Crowley was that he was accused of being a traitor during World War I. He was accused of writing pro-German propaganda. This he did. He claimed, however, he was working for British naval intelligence, and the idea was to make German propaganda so absolutely appalling that the Americans would react against it and come into the war. He did an absolutely magnificent job. I mean, his propaganda was so terrible it deserves a medal. Now, the question is, was he a traitor? Well, the odd thing is, in 1917, America entered the war. Now, you would have thought that if Crowley was really working for German propaganda, they would have interned him, what with the war fever and the hysteria at that time. Somebody at that time gave Crowley enough money to settle his affairs. Moreover, when he returned to England in 1919, despite England's war hysteria at that time, he was not prosecuted as a traitor. Moreover, there is in existence a card in the Warburg Institute of the University of London, and what it's got on it is the following invitation. The Director of Naval Intelligence presents his compliments to Mr. Aleister Crowley and invites him to call upon him, and it was sent, the date is, on the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, the Director of Naval Intelligence in Britain does not ask an alleged traitor to come and see him. Crowley died with that card on him. And I think the reason he had it on him when he died was he was always deeply wounded by the accusations of being a traitor when he was in fact quite a patriot and just wanted it there for everybody to know. But he was sworn to secrecy up until his death. Speaking of his death, did you know that there are 4 versions of the death of Crowley? No, 4 versions. Version number 1 is in John Simon's book. He dies with tears streaming down his face. He goes, boo-hoo-hoo, I am perplexed, clunk. This sounds most unlike him. Version number 2, a loving disciple is there, and she tends him as he passes from samadhi to super samadhi to nirvana to super nirvana, runs up all the trances and expires in the boundless bliss of the infinite. Sounds like a Life of Gautama Buddha written by a nauseatingly sycophantic commentator. Version number 3 was told to me by Herr Ralph Techtmar of Germany, and apparently there's this bookseller in Hastings who'll tell you the story to anyone if you buy him a beer. But he believes that he killed Crowley. You see, Crowley apparently drew the sign on Netherwood, which incidentally wasn't a seedy seaside boarding house. It was a country house with 2 acres of grounds. But Crowley had drawn the sign, and the bookseller felt so disturbed that he took this damp dishcloth and he rubbed it out, and the next day Crowley died. So now we know the truth at last, don't we? The great beast was rubbed out by a dishcloth. The version which I believe to be true was told to me by a man who I have to call Mr. W.H., a chartered accountant of Guildford, I think it was, who got in touch with me because he read in the papers that I was giving a talk on Crowley. And this Mr. W.H., I cannot discern any motive for lying in him. He's got no interest in the occult whatsoever. His claim to fame was that he was manager of Netherwood, which had drawing room, library. The guests lived in considerable comfort, according to him, and certainly according to the photographs I've seen. And he used to talk to Crowley sometimes. But he... Thank you all very much indeed.